We, I feel bad that I'm interrupting our gorgeous music. Is this on? No? Yeah, it is. Oh, is this on? Okay. But we can't do Kol Nidre too late. So what we're going to do is I want to invite all of you to rise. We're going to bench licht together and then put on our tali tot. And I just want to say how wonderful it is to see all of you. Some people who I haven't seen in a long time. It's kind of bringing tears to my eyes. I also want to welcome everybody who's joining us on our Facebook and virtually through our YouTube channel. So glad that you're with us as well. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel yom haKippurim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Take a moment to spread your prayers to all those who you love and are in your hearts. Just take a moment. Good Yontif. So now it's unusual. I don't know if all of you have already put on your tali tot, but this is the one night a year where we wear our kittles, you may be seated, and our talises. And there's a meditation, so I'm wearing my kittle, and I already put it on, but it says, just as I clothe myself in this white garment, so may you purify my soul and my body, as the prophet Isaiah said. Even your sins are like crimson, and they will turn snow white. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lihitatef batzitzit. I want to invite my friend Eric up here. Let me just, for those of you who are just joining us on Yom Kippur, we're not with us on Rosh Hashanah. Our leadership team is Jason Fetty and Ron Levy. And Jackie Mentor is going to be joining us on cello throughout Yom Kippur. We're so lucky, although she wears so many hats all around the county. And this is Eric Dangat. We've been friends for a zillion years, and Eric's now in rabbinical school, and he's also one of Jason and Eric are the spiritual leaders of Temple Isaiah, and this is their weekly home. And so we're honored to be here with them. I want to invite you to turn to page, Jason's going to begin 397 Or Zarua.
Biddy bum bum biddy bum bum biddy bum biddy bum bum biddy bum bum biddy bum bum biddy bum 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 biddy bum 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 biddy bum bum biddy bum bum biddy bum bum biddy bum O Zarua Latzadik Yisrael Simcha Or Zarua Latzadik Simcha We must keep our hope alive. must raise our voices high. We will hold each other tight. Stand up in the night and be light. Oh, Zahu ala tzadik u'liyishrei simcha. Or zaru ala tzadik u'liyishrei lev simcha.
I invite you to rise. The ark will be open, and the Torahs will come out.
First holders.
And I would have you guys just turn around and face the people right there. There we go. We're at the top of 398, and this is where we ask permission to be able to pray with each other, even though nobody in this room is perfect. Vishiva shel mala, uvishiva shel mata, al da'at hamakom, v'al da'at hakahal, anu matirin lehitpalel im ha'avaryanim. We join with Eric on the top of 399.
By the authority of the heavenly court and by the authority of this earthly court, with divine consent and with the consent of this congregation, we hereby declare it permissible to pray with those who have transgressed.
Vishiva shel mala, uvishiva shel mata, al da'at hamakom, v'al da'at hakahal, anu matirin lehitpalel, im ha'avaryanim. Kol Nidre v'yesarei, v'charamei v'konamei, v'chinuyei, v'kinusei, u'shavuot. Din darna, udehish tabana, udiacharimena, v'diasarna, al nafeshatana. Miyom Kippurim zeh ad Yom Kippurim haba aleinu letova kulhon icharat navehon kulhon yehon sharan shevi B'teilin mevutalin la sharirin vela kayamin nidrana la nidre v'yesarana la esare Shavuatana la Shavuot. Come closer, my friends.
Kol Nidre and Ma'ariv Konamei Kinuyei V'chinusei Ushavu Dinadarna Udishtaba על נפשתנה מיום כיפורים זה עד יום הכיפורים הבא עלינו לטובה הכרתנה והון קלון יהון שרן יהון שרן שוויקים מטלין ומבטלין לא שרירים ולא קיימים נדרנה לא נדרה וסרנה לא אסרי ושבתנה לא שבועות
Sandra? This time we're going to all sing together. And the Kol Nidre, which I'll just read in English, is transliterated at the bottom of the page so you can all sing. Read with me first in English and then we'll chant together in Hebrew. All vows, oaths, and promises which we made to God and were not able to fulfill, from last Yom Kippur to this Yom Kippur. May all such vows between ourselves and God be annulled. May they be void and of no effect. May we be absolved of them and released from them. May these vows not be considered vows, these oaths not considered oaths, and these promises not be considered promises. Kol Nidre v'yesarei v'charamei v'konamei v'chinuyei v'kinusei u'shavuot dinadarna u'deishishavana u'diacharimna v'diasarna al nafeshatana miyom kippurim she'avar ad yom kippurim zeh haba aleinu letova kulahon icharat navehon kulhon yehon sharan shevitin betelin umevutalin la sharirin vela kayamin nidrana la nidre v'yesarana la esare ushavuatana la shavuot. I invite you to turn the page to 400. V'nislach lechol adat b'nei Yisrael v'lager hagar b'tocham ki lechol ham b'shegaga.
May forgiveness be granted to the whole congregation of Israel. You can join with me, and to the stranger in their midst, for all the people have transgressed unwittingly.
V'nislach lechol adat b'nei Yisrael v'lager hagar b'tocham ki lechol ham b'shegaga. Selach na lavon ham hazeh kegodel chastecha v'chasher nasata la'am hazeh mimitzrayim v'yad heina v'sham nemar.
In your unbounded mercy, forgive the sin of this people, as you have ever forgiven our people from the days of Egypt until now.
And join Eric together where it says congregation on page 400 towards the bottom.
And the Lord said, I have pardoned them as you have asked.
Vayomer Adonai salachti kidvarecha. When I say Vayomer Adonai, you say the next two words. Vayomer Adonai salachti kidvarecha. Vayomer Adonai salachti kidvarecha. atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Now all of you together.
Shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Praised are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has kept us in life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this season.
Amen.
Amen.
We're going to put our Torahs away and continue with Ma'ariv. Just stay standing for a few more moments. We're just standing through the Baruch Hu. Please join us in what we call the High Holiday Ma'ariv Nigun. By the way, if you are in need of a machzor, if you're joining us virtually, there is a PDF of the Yom Kippur machzor, which is probably put in the chat of, I think it can be in Facebook and Zoom, so I hope you'll join us. We're on page 408. Yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai dai dai. Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamevorach Baruch. Baruch Adonai Hamevorach Leolam Vaed. You may be seated. We join together with Eric on page 409.
We read responsibly in the middle of the page. Praised are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, whose word brings on the dusk of evening.
Dawn. Your understanding regulates time and season.
The stars above follow their appointed rounds in response to your divine will. You remove the day and bring on the night. You separate one from the other.
We call you Lord of heavenly hosts. You are our living God.
May you rule over us as you rule over nature. Praised are you, O Lord, who brings the evening dusk.
Umavir yom, umevi laila, umavdil ben yom uven laila, Adonai, tzevaot shemo, el chai v'kayam, tamid yimloch aleinu leolam vaed, Baruch atah Adonai. I die 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 yai die 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 yai die yai die 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 yai die 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 yai die die Ma'ariv Aravim. We continue on page 410 with Ahavat Olam. ahavat olam, Beit Yisrael, Amcha ahavta, Torah u'mitzvot, Chukim u'mishpatim, Otanu limadta, Al kein Adonai Eloheinu, B'shachveinu u'v'kumeinu, Nasiach b'chukecha, V'nismach b'divrei Toratecha, u'v'mitzvotecha, le'olam va'ed. Ki heim chayenu, v'yorech yameinu, uvahem nehege yomam v'layla. Ki heim chayenu, v'yorech yameinu, Uvahem nehege yomam v'layla, v'yahavatecha al tasir mimenu li'olamim, Baruch atah Adonai, Ohev amo Yisrael.
Amen.
So this is the big moment where, at least in traditional congregations, we not only say the Shema together, but also the next line, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, which was, we stopped saying until sort of the Reform movement came back in the 1800s, because this was something that was only recited in the temple and in response to when the priest would make a blessing. So, L'zecher Churban, in memory of the destruction, we don't do that. Except today, we build our sacred temple in time. On Yom Kippur, it is if the temple was never destroyed, and all Jews everywhere, from every time, sort of gather in Jerusalem at the site of the Beit HaMikdash, where we believe that the essence of God dwelled. Not that we know that God is everywhere, and there's a sense that time is suspended, and now we are with all of our ancestors and all of our future generations. So I invite you to take a deep breath, close your eyes. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. V'yahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavecha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'eleh asher anochi mitzavecha hayom alevavecha Vishinanatam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shivtecha b'veitecha uvelechtecha v'derech uveshochbecha uvekumecha ukshartam liot al yadecha v'hayu letotafot b'neinecha uchtavtam hamizuzot beitecha uvisharecha. A moment as we read the second paragraph of the Shema on page 414 or 415, or just allow your mind to wander, and we'll pick up together on page 416. V'hayim shemo tishmal mitzvotai asher. Please join me on page 416. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta lehem v'yasu lahem tzitzit al kanfei vigdehem ledorotam v'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf b'til techelet v'haya lachem litzitzit ureitem oto uzechartem et kol mitzvot Adonai va'asitem otam v'lo taturu acharei levavechem v'acharei einechem asher atem ezonim achareihem leman tizkiru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'tem kedoshim leloechem Ani Adonai Elohechem Asher hodseiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem le'Elohim Ani Adonai Elohechem Emet. We join together on page 419, reading responsively with Eric. Emet v'emunah, God our Redeemer.
True and certain it is that there is one God, and there is none like our Lord.
It is God who redeemed us from the might of tyrants and delivered us from slavery to freedom.
Great are the things that God has done. The Lord's wonders are without number.
God brought forth Israel from Egyptian bondage and has been our hope in every generation.
May you continue your protecting care over Israel and guard all your children from disaster.
When the children of Israel beheld your might, they gave thanks to you and praised your name.
They accepted your sovereignty willingly and sang in joyous thanksgiving.
Moses and the children of Israel proclaimed in great exultation,
Who is like you, O Lord, among the mighty? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, revered in praises, doing wonders?
when you rescued Israel at the sea, your children beheld your power.
This is my God, they exclaimed and said. The Lord shall reign forever and ever.
As you delivered Israel from a mightier power, so may you redeem all your children from oppression.
Praised are you, O Lord, Redeemer of Israel.
Umalchuto biratzon kiblu aleihem Moshe uvenei Yisrael lechanu shira b'simcha rabba v'amru chulam mi chamocha bailim Adonai Mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh Nora tehilot osei vele Malachutecha ruvanecha Bokei hayam livnei Moshe Zeli anu v'amru. Together Adonai lo le'olam vad. V'nemar ki fada Adonai et Yaakov uge'alo miyad chazak mimenu baruch atah Adonai Gal Yisrael.
Amen.
We continue on page 420, Hashkivenu. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leShalom V'hamidenu Malkeinu leChayim Ufrosolenu Sukkot Shalomecha V'taknenu b'yetza tova milfanecha. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leShalom V'hamidenu Malkeinu leChayim V'hoshienu L'man shemecha V'hagen b'adenu V'haser me'aleinu. Shield us, we pray, against our foes, against plague, destruction, and sorrow. Strengthen us against the evil forces which abound on every side. May we always, for you are our merciful sovereign. Guard us always and everywhere. Bless us with life and peace. Praise to you, O God of peace, whose love is always with us, who shelters your people Israel, and protects Jerusalem in love.
Amen.
Ufros aleinu sukkot shalomecha baruch atah Adonai haporei sukkot shalom aleinu v'yal kol amo Yisrael v'yal Yerushalayim.
Amen.
I invite you to rise, and at the bottom of the page, we will recite together. I'm going to chant to proclaim this day, and then you will read it in English. But so I'm going to chant it, then Eric will say it in Hebrew and then in English. Ki vayom hazeh yechaper aleichem litaher etchem mikol chatoteichem lifnei Adonai titharu.
Ki vayom hazeh yechaper aleichem litaher etchem mikol hatoteichem lifnei Adonai titharu. For on this day atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you. Of all your sins shall you be clean before the Lord.
Chatzi Kaddish on page 422. After the Chatzi Kaddish, we'll have a few minutes to recite the Ma'ariv Amida silently. that begins on page 424, and it concludes on page, you probably figured this out, but just to be clear, on 440. And there are some lovely readings in this book in the back, and so if traditional liturgy is not your thing, that's okay. Allow yourself to sort of really ponder what atonement means and all that. Here we go. Yitkadav v'yitkadash shemei rabbah bi'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'gala uvizman kariv v'imru amen yesh me rabbah mivarach le'alam lamei hamayayi yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudashah berichu le'ela le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran b'yalma v'imru amen. I just want to share before we move into the special prayers just for Yom Kippur, what we call with the Slichot section. At the end of every Yom Kippur Amida, meaning tonight, tomorrow Shacharit, tomorrow Musaf, tomorrow Mincha, interestingly enough, not Ne'ilah, it's left out of the Machzor you have, but the traditional closing paragraph is not the normal one that we say when we end, which is, oh my God, keep my tongue from evil, my lips from lies. That's something that we might be used to. It's this. My God, before I was created, I was entirely lacking in substance. And now that I have been created, it's as if I never was. Dust and ashes am I in life, all the more so in death. I stand before you as a vessel full of embarrassment and shame. May it be your will, Adonai, my God and God of my ancestors, that I sin no more, and that in your great mercy you will erase the sins I have sinned before you, but not through great pain and suffering. Well, it's such an unrealistic paragraph, right? Because, of course, we're all going to sin. What do you mean I'm going to sin no more? But that's one of the hints that on this day, who doesn't sin anymore? Someone who's dead. Honestly, once you're gone, you can't do anything bad. It's over. I mean, maybe you can send really negative karma. I don't know. I'll know when I get there. But what I'm saying is that, that this is the day where we actually rehearse what it'll be like to sin no more. And that's both a beautiful thing in really sort of understanding that death is part of life and that we're not afraid of that. The way I look right now is pretty much how I'll look when I get put in that plain pine box, I'm guessing. And again, I'm not trying to be depressing, but it's really sort of a recognition that this is the way that we're all going to go, and it's really something not to be afraid of. And as long as we're here, how do we make the most of every day so that we are our best selves in human faulty form, right? We can be better. And that's what this whole period of Aseret Yemei Tshuva is about. So I want to, I know if I depressed you, so sorry. Turn to page 446. For Ya'aleh. And this is one of the first special poems for just sung on Yom Kippur evening. And we're going to rotate Hebrew and English. Let me just get to the right page. And I think, okay. So this begins, let our yearning rise to you in the evening. Ya'aleh, Ya'aleh, Tachanunenu, Tachanunenu me'erev, V'yavo Shavatenu mi boker v'yera eridunenu ad arev. Ya'aleh kolenu me'erev ve'yavo tzidkatenu mi-boker ve'yera
Pidyonenu ad arev. Yaleh inuyenu me'erev. V'yavov slichatenu miboker. V'yera'eh na'akatenu. V'yera'eh na'akatenu ad arev.
May our trust in you rise up at nightfall, our hope be granted for your sake in the morning, and our atonement come at dusk.
Please join us.
May our deliverance mount at nightfall, our cleansing come to us in the morning, and your favor come to us at dusk. May our remembrance rise to you at nightfall, our assemblage be acceptable to you in the morning, and your glory shine upon us at dusk.
Ya'aleh dovkeinu me'erev, ve'yavo gileinu miboker, ve'yera'eh bakashatenu ad arev. Ya'aleh en katenu me'erev, V'yavo elecha miboker, v'yera'eh eleinu, v'yera'eh eleinu ad arev.
Please turn to page 448 and 449. I'm going to read a line in Hebrew, and you'll read across the page in English. Shomea tefillah odecha kol basar yavo'u.
O God who hears prayer, to you shall all creatures come.
Yavo'u v'yishtachavu lefanecha Adonai v'chabdu lishmecha.
They shall come and worship before you and render homage to your name.
Bo nishtachaveh v'nichra'a v'nivracha lifnei Adonai osenu.
Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us bend the knee before the Lord our Maker.
This is the Hunaranana is a special sort of collection of verses from different psalms that's sung 2 times a year, one on Slichot and on Yom Kippur.
Lecho neranana l'Adonai, nariya letzor yishenu, nekadma fanav betoda, bizemirot, nariya lo. Tzedek u'mishpat mechon gisecha, chesed ve'emet yikarmu fanecha, asher yachtach dav namtik sod, beveit Elohim nalech b'ragesh, asher lo hayam behu asahu, ve'yabeshet yadav yatsaru, asher biado nefesh kol chai, veruach kol besarish. Haneshama lach vehaguf balach chusa המלאך והגוף שלך, אדוני עשה למען שמך, הנשמה לך והגוף שלך, אדוני עשה למען שמך. התנו על שמך אדוני עשה למען שמך, בעבור כבוד שמך, כי אל חנון ורחום, ורחום שמך, למען שמך אדוני, וסלחת לעווננו, כי רב הוא. We continue on page 450, Ki hine kachomer, as clay in the hand of the potter, who thickens or thins at will, so we are in your hand, O God of love. And we're going to do, this is what I was wrong about, I'll add. This is going to be Hebrew, English, and we all can say together, recall your covenant, forgive our sin. Ki hine kach omer biyad hayotzer, ברצותו מרחיב וברצותו מקצר, כן אנחנו בידך חסד נוצר, לברית הבית ואל תפן ליצר.
Recall your covenant, forgive our sin. Join with me in the English for the next paragraph. As stone in the hand of the mason, who preserves or breaks it at will, so are we in your hand, O God of life. Recall your covenant, forgive our sin.
La brita beit v'al tefen la yetzer. Third paragraph. Ki hine kagarzen b'yad hacharash, ברצותו דיבק לאור ברצותו וירש, כן אנחנו בידך תומך אני ברש, לברית הבית ואל תפן ליצר.
Recall your covenant, forgive our sin. Join with me. As glass in the hand of the blower, who shapes or melts it at will, so are we in your hand, O gracious God. Recall your covenant, forgive our sin.
La brita beit v'al tefen layetzer, ki hine ki zchut biyad hamizagzeg, birtzoto chogeg uvirtzoto mimogeg, ken anachnu biyadecha ma'avir zadon v'shogeg, la brita beit v'al tefen layetzer.
Recall your covenant, forgive our sin. As silver in the hand of the smelter, who alloys or refines it at will, so are we in your hand, O healing God. Recall your covenant, forgive our sin.
La brita beit v'al tefen la'etzer. Last paragraph. Ki hine kesef b'yad hatzoref, birtzoto misakseg uvirtzoto mitzaref, ken anachnu biyadecha mamtzilim azor taref labrit habeit v'al tefen la'yetzer.
Recall your covenant, forgive our sin.
Please, God. We continue on page 454,
as Jason leads us in El Melech Yoshev, his own composition.
אל מלך יושב על כיסא רחמים, מתנהג בחסידות, מוחל עוונות עמות, מוחל עוונות עמות, מעביר ראשון ראשון, שומע כל סליחה, מעביר ראשון 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 לכל אחד, מרבה מחילה לחטאים וסליחה לפושעים, עושה צדקות עם כל בשר ורוח, חטאים תגמור, מעביר ראשון ראשון, שומע כל סליחה, מעביר ראשון 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 לכל אחד. ידידיי, 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 מעביר ראשון ראשון, שומע כל סליחה, מעביר ראשון 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 לכל אחד, לכל אחד.
We join together on page 455, the Throne of Mercy. And this, in a traditional machzor, which you would actually say El Melech Yoshev 7 times tonight between different piyutim. We're going to do it once. And we read responsively with Eric.
O God, our sovereign, enthroned in mercy, you rule with loving kindness. You are generous in forgiveness to sinners. You deal mercifully with all creatures, not according to the evil of their deeds. Remember, as you judge us, the covenant of mercy which you then revealed.
Vayavor Adonai al panav vayikra Adonai Adonai El Rachum v'chanun Erech apayim B'rav chesed v'emet Notzer chesed Lalafim Nosei avon v'fesha V'chata v'nakei V'salachta La'avonenu U'lechatatenu U'nechaltanu V'lach lanu Avinu Ki chatanu V'lach lanu Avinu Ki chatanu Mechalanu Malkeinu Ki fashanu Ki ata Adonai tov v'salach V'rav chesed lecho korecha V'rav chesed lecho korecha Selach lanu Avinu Ki chatanu We rise as the ark is open for Shema Kolenu.
Page 458. If you want to pull back the curtain too.
I'll chant a line in Hebrew, you'll read opposite in English. Shema Kolenu Adonai Eloheinu Chus v'rachem aleinu Chus v'rachem aleinu V'kabel ברחמים וברצון את תפילתנו.
Hear our voice, Lord our God. Spare us, pity us, accept our prayer in your gracious love.
השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם.
Turn us to you, O Lord, and we shall return. Renew us as in days of old.
אל תשליכנו מלפניך ורוח קודשך אל תיקח ממנו.
Do not banish us from your presence. Do not deprive us of your Holy Spirit.
אל תשליכנו לעת זקנה, ככלות כוחנו, אל תעזבנו.
Do not cast us off in old age. When our strength declines, do not forsake us.
אל תעזבנו אדוני אלוהינו, אל תרחק ממנו.
Do not forsake us, O Lord our God. Do not make yourself distant from us. Close the curtain of the ark.
Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu, Silach lanu, Mechalanu, page 460, Gaper lanu, Kianu, Amecha, V'ata Eloheinu, Anu, Vanecha, V'ata Avinu, Anu, avadecha v'ata Adonenu anu kehalecha v'ata chelkeinu anu nachalatecha v'ata goralenu anu sonecha v'ata roenu anu charmecha v'ata nodrenu anu peulatecha v'ata yotzrenu anu rayatecha v'ata dodenu anu seguatecha v'ata kerovenu anu amecha v'ata malkeinu anu ma'amirecha v'ata ma'amirenu anu azefanim v'ata rachum v'chanun anu kasheyoref v'ata erech apayim anu malei avon v'ata malei rachamim anu yameinu kitzel over v'atahu ushnotecha lo yitamu 462 Eloheinu v'Elohei avoteinu tavo lefanecha tefilatenu v'al titalam mitechinatenu she'nanachnu azefanim ukesheyoref lomar lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu tzadikim anachnu v'lo chatanu aval anachnu chatanu ay 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 Ashamnu Bagadnu Gazalnu Dibarnu Dofi Hevinu Vehirshanu Zadnu Chamasnu Tafalnu Sheker ay 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 Yatznu Ra Kizavnu Latnu Maradnu Niyatznu Sararnu Avinu Pashanu Sararnu Kishinu Oref ay 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 Rashanu Shichatnu Tiavnu Tainu Titanu. We've turned away from your mitzvot and your goodly laws, and we are poor for our disobedience. You are just in all that has come upon us. You have been faithful, we have not. We turn ahead to page 468, and we're going to go right into the Al-Chetz. This is a new Al-Chetz. We're going to sing the chorus, but we're going to read in English responsively. This is they're really not new Al-Chetz. We've been doing them forever, but it's just a new page. Here we go. Mechalanu kaper lanu. We read responsibly with Eric.
For the sin of the hardened heart,
And for the sin of the tale-bearing lips,
for the sin of the lustful look,
and for the sin of the pious mask,
for the sin of enjoying violence,
and for the sin of polluting your earth,
for the sin of debasing our speech,
and for the sin of degrading your name,
for the sin of the yes that was no,
and for the sin of the promise unkept.
for all these sins, O God of forgiveness, forgive us, pardon us, grant us atonement.
V'yakulam Eloah slichot, salach lanu, mechalanu, kaper lanu.
For the sin of the covetous eye,
And for the sin of the haughty head,
for the sin of the insensitive soul,
and for the sin of the mocking voice,
for the sin of the clenched fist,
and for the sin of the deceitful smile,
for the sin of eating too much,
and for the sin of drinking too hard,
for the sin of not hearing the oppressed,
and for the sin of closing our eyes,
for all these sins, O God of forgiveness, forgive us, pardon us, grant us atonement.
Ve'yakulam Eloah slichot, salach lanu, mechalanu, kaper lanu. And we turn to page 472 for an ark opening for Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Chatanu lefanecha, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Ein lanu melech ela ata, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Achazirenu b'teshuva shlema levanecha, Avinu Malkeinu, Chadesh Aleinu, Chadesh Aleinu, Shana Tova. Avinu Malkeinu shalach revuah shlema l'cholei amecha, Avinu Malkeinu chafer atzar oiveinu, Avinu Malkeinu zachrenu v'zichron tov levanecha, Avinu Malkeinu kodveinu b'sefer chayim tovim. Repeat after me. Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu b'sefer Geula v'Yeshua.
Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu b'sefer Geula v'Yeshua.
Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu b'sefer Parnasah v'Chalkala.
Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu b'sefer Parnasah v'Chalkala.
Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu b'sefer Zichuyot.
Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu b'sefer Zichuyot.
Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu b'sefer Selicha u'Mechila.
Avinu Malkeinu Kadvenu sefer Selicha u'Mechila.
Avinu Malkeinu Atzmach Lanu Yeshua B'Karo. Avinu Malkeinu Arim Karen Yisrael Amecha. Avinu Malkeinu Shema Kolenu Chus V'Rachem Aleinu. Avinu Malkeinu Kabel B'Rachamim V'Ratzona Tefilatenu. Avinu Malkeinu Chamol Aleinu V'Yalal Aleinu V'Tapenu. Avinu Malkeinu Aseh L'Ma'an Ba'e Va'esh V'Mayim. Avinu Malkeinu Aseh L'Ma'an. Avinu Malkeinu Chonenu Vaneinu Avinu Malkeinu Chonenu Vaneinu Ki ein banu masim Aseh imanu tzedaka v'chesed Aseh imanu tzedaka v'chesed v'hoshienu. And the ark is closed. Thank you. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah.
Amen.
V'yalma divra kirutei v'yamlich machlutei b'chayechon v'yamechon v'chaydechol beit Yisrael b'agalav v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevarach la'olam la'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekudashah. Berechu li'ela li'ela mikol berchata v'shirata dush bechata v'nechamata da'amiran b'yalma v'imru amen. Titkabel tzolot honu v'od hon d'chol Yisrael kodamu v'hon divishmaya v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Hoseh shalom b'romav v'yaseh shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. You may be seated. And now, I've been looking for, I've just realized I cannot find my notes, my introduction to our guests, but I want to invite, oh, here it is, right here, always been here the whole time. How do you like that? I want to invite Rabbi Levy and Lisa Armoni and my husband, Scott Spitzer, and so I figured Lisa and Peter would stay in the middle. There we go. So I'm very excited about this panel in lieu of a Devar Torah. When the Jewish Collaborative held its first Kol Nidre service in 2016, we hosted a panel moderated by Rabbi Levy based on a book titled America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge. People still comment on that forum, and most Erev Yom Kippur sermon slots have since been dedicated to addressing the moral challenges of our time. There are almost too many to count right now. What recorded history has revealed in the last 1,100 years is that when things are in chaos, it seems to be very effective for everyone, even sworn enemies to one another, to blame the Jews. In recent history, that includes a hyper-focus on Israel and a manipulation of Israel's internal challenges. From biblical times, Israelites have had a complicated relationship with their Arab brethren. That tension remains. Jumping ahead 1,000 years, Jewish people, unwilling to convert, were at first resented by the church and later Islam. A journey into history helps us understand how we became and forever will be the world's punching bag. Jewish survival and flourishing through the ages remain a mystery to most of the world. Perpetrated lies notwithstanding, we are envied, resented, and hated by people, most of whom have never even met a Jewish person. Our numbers are so negligible, and really 90% of the world's Jewish population is concentrated in 7 regions. Jews are an anomaly in most of the world. Judaism and anti-Semitism are greatly misunderstood. I encourage all of you to watch a recording of a very informative program hosted by our Federation last Thursday to commemorate 20 years since the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that was held in Durban, South Africa, that was distortedly focused on Israel as an apartheid country. I learned so much, and Lisa, I want to thank you for putting that program together. It's available on the Federation website. The presenters did an excellent job of breaking down how we as Jews now find ourselves being labeled as perpetrators of racism. It is bizarre. Combating the anti-Semitic assaults at any given time requires vigilance and strategy. Our 2 panelists tonight are dedicated both personally and professionally to addressing hate in general and anti-Semitism in particular. Lisa Armoni is the director of the Rose Project and chief impact officer of the Jewish Federation of Orange County. The value of her work locally, helping us navigate anti-Semitic challenges on campus, empowering teens to face a new frontier, serving as a leader in interfaith dialogue, and educating our community about Israel's history and challenges cannot be overstated. After many years in the pulpit, Rabbi Peter Levy is now a community leader fighting hate of all kinds as regional director of the Anti-Defamation League. He and Lisa have always worked in tandem, but of late their paths have been crossing with even greater frequency as the threat of anti-Semitism has become ever more prominent in the past 4 months. Dr. Scott Spitzer is a professor of political science at Cal State University Fullerton and teaches a course annually on the Middle East conflict. He is the faculty advisor to Hillel and is involved with the Academic Engagement Network, which is a DC-based nonprofit that mobilizes college campus faculty and staff to oppose efforts to delegitimize Israel, promote campus-free expression and academic freedom, support research, education, and robust dialogue about Israel in the academy, and counter anti-Semitism when it occurs. Last but not least, Robin Gurian is a community servant and activist whose well of compassion runs deep. By day, she works for the County of Orange and is a professor of communications at Cal State Fullerton. She is committed to inclusion, speaking out against injustice, and supporting those in need. In recent years, Robin has found herself being pushed out of certain circles because of her Judaism and belief in Israel's right to exist and defend itself. This has opened her eyes to a new kind of anti-Semitism in our midst, generated by people with whom many of us would have thought we shared a value system guided by Torah ethics. Combating anti-Semitism has become an important part of her volunteer profile. I want to welcome all 4 of you.
Okay, well, first of all, can you guys hear me in the back? No. Use the mic. I'm going to use the mic. I'm trying to get it on. That's my problem. There we go. Technology and me are oftentimes not friends. Thank you, Marcia, for introducing me as Dr. Spitzer. That's very nice. But I am also your husband. And Shana Tova to everyone. This is such an important topic, and I'm really humbled to be with you guys tonight. You're all doing such important work in our community, and so let me turn the beginning of the program over to Robin, and we'll take it from there.
It's odd for me to actually need a mic Nobody has ever accused me of being soft-spoken, but I'll use the mic tonight. So my first question to both of you is that, we as living a life of Judaism and Jewishness, we're aware of what the traditional anti-Semitism, what those tropes look like. What's different now? Lisa, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. I'm struggling a little bit with this, so I don't know if you can hear me okay. Yeah, should I use this? Okay, thank you. That's easier. Thanks. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, I'll hold it close. Okay. So first of all, good evening, Shana Tova and Gemar Chatima Tova, and thank you, Marcia and Jason and everybody for the incredible, inspiring service, and it's really an honor to be here, even to talk about anti-Semitism. So what's new about this time? Well, I think there's a couple of things that are new, but I also want to just spend a moment on what's not so new, what's old, because I think that's really important. We talk about anti-Semitism, and sometimes we think we have a shared understanding, and sometimes we actually don't have a shared understanding. So we're very used to talking about viruses today. So I'm gonna use that metaphor, even though it's not the most pleasant one right now. But anti-Semitism really is it's very much like a virus, and at its core are certain elements that we see. Certain conspiratorial theories, which really keep mutating, as any good virus does, time after time after time, depending on the environment, the milieu, the society that is espousing that anti-Semitism. And typically, what happens when that virus mutates is that the Jewish people are accused of the most heinous crimes or the most evil, anxieties or evil ideologies that society believes in or considers to be the most evil. So for Christianity, of course, we were the committers of deicide, and for the Nazis, we were an impure race, and for the communists, we were the embodiment of capitalism. So it's really, so in that sense, what we're seeing today is very similar to what we've seen in the past. One of the mutations that we're seeing today, particularly on the progressive far left, has to do, is really embedded in the ideology or the worldview of the progressive left. And you have to understand that, you have to really understand what the pillars of the progressive far left are. They view the world through the lens of white supremacy, imperialism, settler colonialism, and patriarchy. And as a result, the evil that is ascribed to the Jew is very much white supremacy and imperialism. And so, but what's interesting is that it's not just the Jewish people, and because the other new thing today is the state of Israel. And so, in the eyes of the ideologue with this that holds this sort of agenda, Israel is the extreme example of settler colonialism or imperialism. And the Jew that believes in Israel's right to exist upholds that ideology of settler colonialism, and that's why we find today that the Jews in America and in Europe and elsewhere are very much the target of this extreme left ideology. And just to complete that thought, before I'll pass it on to Peter, because the lens through which they view the world is very much the white supremacist oppressor who is oppressing the person of color, the people of color. And because when they see a Jew that looks like me, white skin, even though we know that not all Jews look like me.
Actually, me. White.
Okay, male. Okay, even more so. Even more so. But people like us become the embodiment, the only expression of the Jew, and so we get categorized in that with the white supremacists. So we are, in their eyes, we are just, we are guilty of all of the worst crimes in their view. And I think that's really what we're seeing. Those, and Marcia, you spoke about how, Robin, you're feeling really pushed out, really marginalized in some progressive circles where you're there based on common values, common commitment to certain core principles. And yet, to some of those people in that community, you embody everything that is the antithesis of that ideology. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll pass it on to Peter.
So, I just want to bring two really important Jewish texts, right? Obviously, and mine's right? It's Yom Kippur, where tomorrow we're going to read about the scapegoat, which is where you take your sins and your challenges and problems and put it on a goat and sacrifice that, right? And what we learned is anti-Semitism is people take their own sins, their own challenges, their own problems, and put it on the Jewish people. That's one text. The other text is potentially a more vital one for our era. It's called Fiddler on the Roof. Where they're packing up to leave Anatevka, and someone says, Rabbi, wouldn't this be a good time for the Messiah to come? And he's like, yes, but we'll have to go and pray for the Messiah somewhere else. Pack up and go. And I mentioned that because one of my early teachers said that they always have their passport up to date and in their bedside stand. Right? And then I look over and I see Scott's wearing running shoes. Right? And I'm like, he is ready! Avi and Scott are going to beat us all out the door if we need to run. It's like, there's something about the Jewish condition about, we're ready to go. And what's that about? So, a little, brief, we can't know what's different now if we don't look at historical context, right? So in simple terms, in medieval times, you think of the Inquisition, right? The Jews weren't Christians and they were persecuted because of their religion. And then you look at modernity and eugenics in Nazi Germany, and where the term anti-Semitism was actually developed in mid-19th century Germany, because with this new modern idea, right, the religion wasn't enough, right, with this rise of pseudoscience of race science, right? We didn't want to call them Jews because that was the religion. So they came up with the German term for anti-Semitic because it was your race that we hated. Even if you converted, you were still of that race. But of course, so it went from religion to race. And now, right, it's been 73 years, we have the modern state of Israel. And the common denominator between the modern state of Israel, our race or ethnicity, and our religion is the Jewish people, which is what's fundamental to everything. And that there are just different expressions at different times in history, seizing on the opportunities of what the current mode is, whether or not it's religion or the science of race, or now, right, the argument is social justice, particularly here in America, right? And that's what Lisa was referring to, sort of that progressive agenda, right, of patriarchy, racism, and my kids would say capitalism, but we're going to leave it with imperialism. So, you debate whether or not capitalism is part of that. Right? 30% of the 18 to 30-year-olds in the Pew survey that came out 2 months ago say they think they are anti-capitalists. Right? So just you're on a college campus, you tell me about it. Okay, so that is sort of the context that we have. So what's happening is the sins of America, which is 400 years of racism. What we talked about 5 years ago when we first gathered with about stealing the land from the indigenous people and building the wealth on the backs of slaves. And how do we deal that as Americans living in this country, as the communal sin that we all benefit from? How do we reconcile that? Well, America is starting to reconcile it, trying to have a discussion about what that reconciliation looks like. Some are rejecting it, some are embracing it. But what's happening, there's a framework and a language that's coming in. But now we're imposing those sins of America on a foreign country, the state of Israel. Right? That's what the trend. So we're seeing a racialization of what's happening in Israel, white versus people of color, which of course we know the challenges, as Marcia referred to earlier, right, is much older than A, our country, you know, and B, certainly the state of Israel. But there's this, I'm trying to racialize it in that capacity to develop sort of an American empathy. But it could also be a guise or a facade for the same age-old hatred of the Jewish people, whether or not that's through the state, through the race, or through the religion, right? It's a new facade. That doesn't mean to say there isn't legitimate criticism of Israeli policy. We're not talking about that. Just ask an Israeli, and they'll have no trouble criticizing the government, right? Or a member of Knesset, or read Haaretz, right? So there's no problem of criticizing policy. But what happens is when that becomes sort of the criticism chipping away at the legitimacy of his state. And then I think sort of part two of what Lisa referred to is that who identifies who the Jewish people are. This is the other side of that history coin on Jewish identity. During modernity, the Jewish people experimented with two ideas of Jewish identity. One, which started in 1810 in Germany, the reformers, right, were saying, wow, now that Napoleon's here, we're being invited out of the ghettos. Let's be a religion like our Protestant partners. Let's turn Judaism, which was a peoplehood, into a religion, so now we can interact in business, in education, in the streets, socially with our neighbors. So let's look more like them. America embraced that really strongly. Now the other experience is what we call modern Zionism. They said, in the birth of, the Jews have gotten kicked out of countries 500 plus times in our history. But it was only in modernity did they start saying, maybe we should start our own country and go to Israel, right? The response was more like, Fiddler on the Roof, right? Go somewhere else and pray. But I know that was modernity. But in modernity, it was like, wow, there's the rise of the nation state as colonialism falls apart and nation states and democracies and modern ideas of government are developing. Maybe we should be like that. So these two experiments, one was turn Judaism and the Jewish people into a religion, and the other was turn it into a nationality, right? So the Reform movement, which was, you might say, the extreme in turning into a religion, it wasn't working so well, and peoplehood has come back with a vengeance, with the Reform movement. And the nationality, right, you don't have to be a Jew anymore, it's enough to be Israeli, that's also not working. There's it's been a generation of secular Israelis realizing it's not enough to be Israeli. Judaism and our texts and our sources and our people and our connection. What other country cares about diaspora interrelations? Like, why? Israel's the only country that wants Jews outside of Israel and to get along because they realize that it's so much more. Israel is really there for all of us, not just the residents of that country. America, is schizophrenic on whether or not we even send a ballot to the expats who live outside the country. It's a whole, but it's so integral to who we are as Jews. So I think also understanding that, what's happened is that the sort of the extreme one end of the spectrum has embraced those two failed experiments that the Jewish people are trying to get over and say, right, that if you're only a nationality, you're a religious group that's trying to be a nationality, and that is a trickery, and you have no right to a state. And the other side is you're just a religion, and you have no right to a state. So when we criticize Israel, that is not anti-Semitic, because we're not criticizing Judaism, because you're a religion like the rest of us.
So thank you so much for that. You just gave us so much to think about, both of you. And I'm just wondering, though, I want to go back to Robin's original question. I want to fine-tune it a little bit more, because you're both saying that this is a historic phenomena, anti-Semitism, and that we've had ebbs and flows of anti-Semitism, but it's always been a potent force in humanity. And so I want to ask, is there something different going on now And how would you characterize that now? And both of you mentioned this identification with a delegitimization of Israel and the connection of that to Jewish identity. And I want to push you more on that. And then the second piece of this that I would like you to both address is this really a widespread thing? Or are we talking about, white supremacists in Charlottesville and left-wing cranks on college campuses, but most of American evangelicals, 90 million, love Israel, support the Jews? I'm being a little provocative on purpose here. So.
Lisa and I talk about this all the time, so we don't even know where to start.
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think one of the things. I mean, if we're really going to unpack what's happening around Israel and this idea, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs calls it the new anti-Semitism, because I think that's part of what you're getting at, Scott. And classic I'm going to quote Erwin Kotler, who was the former Justice Minister of Canada and was a delegate at Durban. Everybody's talking about Durban because the 20th anniversary is next week, and so a lot of the original Durban, they call themselves the Durban survivors, are now speaking about what that experience was like. And so Erwin Kotler talks about the difference between classical anti-Semitism and new anti-Semitism. He says classical anti-Semitism is an assault upon Jews to live as equal members of a society. The new anti-Semitism is an assault upon Israel to live as an equal member of the international community. Both are forms of discrimination, one on Jews, the other on Israel, as the embodiment of the collective Jew. And so I think, when we think about what's happening with Israel, this notion, and it's very timely because we saw it really emerge on the international scene at the Durban conference. This notion of the criminalization of Israel, the accusations of the worst human rights violations in an era where that is really shaped by commitment to human rights. The aftermath of World War II, we saw the creation of international conventions on human rights, really to make sure that the international community could uphold basic rights and dignity. And so what we're seeing now is, as I said before, when we think about anti-Semitism, ascribing a society's worst evils or worst anxieties on the scapegoat, on the Jew, now it's on Israel. So we see these accusations of apartheid, of genocide, of crimes against humanity, really, and what Kotler calls really the redefinition of these terms that have been enshrined in these human rights conventions in order to fit the agenda of the anti-Semite who's actually the new anti-Semite and is targeting Israel. So I think that's very much part of what this is all about, this agenda to delegitimize the existence, the right to exist of the state of Israel through the manipulation of these human rights, of the human rights lexicon, and then by extension to marginalize or demonize Jews who hold any kind of commitment to Israel. And that's not to say a commitment to certain Israeli policies or their preference for a particular Israeli government or a political leader. But what we see on college campuses, for example, and it's not just on college campuses anymore. Sadly, we're seeing it in high school campuses, and we're seeing it in different arenas, is if you, as a Jew, or even as a non-Jew, believe that Israel has a right to exist, or you have an identity connection to Israel, you're really marginalized. You are deemed as part of the problem. You're part of the oppressor, and I think that's really at the core of what we're seeing today. And then there's one more piece of it that I want to mention. Well, yeah, but I got to give you time to talk too. The other piece is this effort by those who hold this anti-Israel agenda to rewrite the Jewish story, to rewrite our narrative. And that includes efforts to redefine anti-Semitism. And it's very crafty and it's very clever. We see it in the forms of statements like, the Jews have no connection to the land of Israel, that they're foreign invaders, they're imposters, right? That it's all a story that they've made up in order to justify their settler colonialism of Palestine. These are the kinds of things we're hearing, or that, anti-Semitism, there are no forms of anti-Zionism that are anti-Semitic. How could there be? Because anti-Semitism is hatred against the Jewish religion. Well, we know that's not true. We know that anti-Semitism is much, much more. It's hatred targeted at the Jewish people, not just at the Jewish religion, but these efforts to change the definition of anti-Semitism so that they can exonerate themselves from accusations of anti-Semitism is all part and parcel of this. And the biggest problem with that is not only are they trying to change the narrative and change the definitions, but many of our young people who aren't getting Jewish education or Israel education are starting to believe it. And that's something that Peter and I deal with all the time. We've started working with teens. We have a couple of teen programs that we do because we understand that so many of our kids here in our community are hearing this stuff. They're seeing it on social media, and either they're starting to believe it or they don't know. They don't know what's true, what's not true. And that's really tragic. That's where we really run the risk of losing the next generation.
Right, and 2007 is really the year. But let me get some more context. Right, generation, I'm too young, and I'm not young, to remember 1948 and that miracle of the creation of the state. I am too young, though I was on this earth, to remember 67 and what that meant. Right, my first learning anything of Israel was the war in Lebanon in the early 80s, which everyone referred to as Israel's Vietnam. And then it went into Intifada 1 and Intifada 2, and that is sort of the realm. So those warm, good, exciting, everyone's behind Israel as a state feelings in the Jewish people, that isn't around anymore, except for my parents' generation, and they're dying out right now. So that's one thing. Two, 2007, the iPhone was invented. And that's what changed everything, right? 2010 or 11, right, Instagram came out, right? So, and everyone had a camera and a video. And that changed the social justice attention of our country. It's been 55 years since the civil rights legislation passed, right, in 1965. But that wasn't enough because people didn't believe it until they saw it. And we had to see it over and over and over again. And when George Floyd was murdered last May, and we saw over 9 minutes of him suffocating with people 15 feet away saying, "You're murdering him, you're killing him, he can't breathe." And a white, male agent of the state, a police officer, kneeling on his neck. We couldn't deny it. Right? It was the largest social justice actions last summer, right? Over 24 million Americans marched in the streets. That has never happened in the history of the world. Right? And that was just America, right? Around the world, people marched. So that put things to the fore. And the challenge is you can't learn nuanced, complex history on Instagram, right? But people are trying, right? Or that's where it is. So look, I talked to I talk to high school, college students and their families. I talk to community rabbis all the time. And especially since May, when the conflict between Israel and Hamas. But it was certainly for years before that, but especially since May, literally every high school and every college student saw their friends post and repost, memes, language, quotes from from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, stuff about Zionism, and they didn't even know what they were posting, what the context was, how it was offensive. It's like, these are oppressed people. We're Americans. We root for the underdogs, right? That's part of what we do here. And so over and over again, there was this assault on, young American, open-minded, caring about other people, and in this framework, right? Especially with sort of the Black Lives Matter and the protests. And so we have a lot of context, we have a lot of sharing, we have a lot of misinformation, which is mistaken, we have a lot of disinformation, which is deliberately misleading people, we have a lot of blind spots, people just don't know enough to have any context for it. So this is what combines together to create this deep assault on Jewish identity. We're just a religion, therefore if I criticize the state, it has nothing to do with Jewish people. We had a lecture at the largest mosque in Orange County in June that actually put it out on the internet so you could read about it and more people can share about it, saying that the Jewish people have no historical connection to the land of Israel, that they're Europeans, we're all converts and therefore have no claim, they're just a religion with no historical connections. We've seen at UC Irvine in February of this year pass a BDS, a boycott, divest, and sanction resolution. The opening line was, this has nothing to do with Judaism, we're only talking about Israel. Thank you, members of the elected Senate at UCI, for defining Jewish identity for the rest of the Jewish world that's been connected to Israel since God said to Abraham, this is not your home, move. That was Genesis 12:1 for those. Right? So this is sort of the assault. This is what we're being confronted with, and so many of our youth, not those here, right? But so many are caring, compassionate people, have too many blind spots, right? In our congregations, right? We can't get kids to care about Yom Kippur. How are we going to get them to care about Israel? How do we create a context? And we have the zeitgeist, right, is root for the underdogs. We've got to, whether or not it's black folks in America that have 400 years of oppression, whether or not it's indigenous people that have been beat up, moved around, and abused and killed, whether or not it's Asian folks that have taken sort of the brunt of the harassment and physical assaults during this pandemic. And so what happened in May? Every high school student, every college student, over and over again, feeling this assault on their identity if they were connected to Israel because of the conflict and what was happening. B, we had this lecture. C, we had, I actually had to write it down because there were so many things that were happening. One, we had another high school had a spontaneous club that was supposed to meet about to give the history of the settler colonial project of the Zionists. And that was just one high school. I'm sure it was happening a dozen places. There was a school principal, a well-meaning school principal, who wanted to reach out for because they care about children, and reached out about all the Palestinian children. And I received more complaints to the ADL on this than almost anything, because every Jewish family at the school said, you've reached out to Black Lives Matter and black families, you've reached out when there's Asian hate, and it's fine that you're reaching out to Palestinians, we have the empathy, but 4,400 plus bombs have rained down in Israel. And there's silence. I think the term was bupkis, right? But there's absolute silence. And it's like, what? It's like, yes, sensitive, but when you make us invisible, right, that terrifies us. And final thing, apartheid, using the apartheid term, right? For Jews that still have intergenerational trauma from the Holocaust, from the pogroms, we can keep going back. This thing keeps cycling up. These traumas that when we hear anything that can become an existential threat, and apartheid sounds like an existential. It may not be. It might be just a term, but it feels to many in the Jewish community like an existential threat to the state of Israel. And that halts all conversation. And it's not helping move things forward, right? So, you know, this is the environment we're in right now because of the iPhone.
So, it's actually,
Steve Jobs' fault.
yeah.
Lost it.
So as we're talking about the kinds of the places where we see these messages happening and how our students, I mean, it happened to my own college student in May, where we had a professor on the campus who he was taking the class from a professor who thought she was doing the right thing by completely changing her syllabus so that they didn't have to discuss the soundtrack to a movie that happened to have that was featuring an Israeli actress. And so there's this overextending. I wonder though, and I myself having experienced that kind of silencing and that kind of overextension in my own work, I wonder where else we're seeing this. Is it only in education? Do we only have to go to K through 12 and our colleges and stop it there? Or where else is it happening?
So just real quick, that's where the young generation is, right? Because they're all in education, right? K to 12 is mandatory, and 33% of the country is on a college campus. It's not every college campus. They're going for the elite campuses. So so the UC system, the Cal States, and other elite institutions is where it's happening. Why? Because that's where you get press. That's where you can get it out.
Not so much at not so much at Cal State Fullerton, which is kind of interesting.
Except, but the apartheid wall is there.
Yeah, we have
4 years ago they tried to kick ADL off campus.
Sure, we had BDS.
So so it's not you're not Pomona, right? But it happens at Cal State Fullerton.
Moments, yes.
San Diego State also.
Yeah, clearly, I think once again, the California, it's the largest university system in the country. So the Cal States have to be part of that. So you're seeing strategic places targeted. You're not seeing a lot of these big football campuses in the middle of the country, right? They're not being targeted in the same way. But we're in California, and this is where we see it. So yeah, part of it is investment in the next generation. So you've got to go to where they are. You also got to go to where you can make headlines, right? This is commonality of all extremists. If you can't make headlines, if you can't get out there, you're not recruiting people, you're not raising money, you're not bringing people over into your realm, right? So that's also why the social media, which has such widespread, is such a vehicle, right? We saw ISIS take advantage of that in such a strong and effective way. We see it happen on the right and left. We have the former social media influencer who used to live in the White House.
Peter, I'm going to add something to your comment about the schools, because we certainly see it on the college campuses, and I think you're right about the idea of, there's two things. I think the idea of where they can get attention, and also where they can be influential, particularly over people where they're students where they're sharing common values, but who don't know a whole lot about the Middle East conflict. And so there's a lot of networking and relationship building that happens among students in order to bring them into this discourse, this anti-Israel discourse. But the other piece of the campus coin is the academics, the faculty, and I think this anti-Zionism has really flourished in the academy for the last 20 years. It's been, I don't think we've seen anything like this in the academy since the anti-Vietnam movement. And so, and because of that, we see faculty really exercising some people call it academic freedom. Scott, you're probably a better judge of this than me. I think it's an abuse of power, because they are, when they're in the classroom and they're teaching, they are in a position of power, and they're using that platform to teach their own agenda. very often, in the case of somebody who's anti-Zionist, a toxic agenda, to students who are really, who are in this class and because it's a power dynamic, they're not always in a position to push back, nor do they necessarily want to, nor do they necessarily have the knowledge to do so.
Right. So just to extend that, in ADL we use a model that we call the long tail model. And if you think of like a dragon, it's got a head, a body, and a really long tail. And the head are the hardcore delegitimizers, who really were at Durban and at the beginning of sort of BDS as a global movement. And the body are these academics, leaders of NGOs, journalists, all sorts of other sort of nonprofit organizations, social justice or civil rights organizations. So you have a huge body that are, really feeding off that head of the delegitimization. And then they move, there's the tail, it starts thick and then it thins out, right? And here's where we get student leaders, on campuses and in communities and other community-based organizations. But what they're doing is that they're moving the needle on the zeitgeist, on where the spirit is on many campuses and also like in many cities, particularly sort of progressive-leaning cities. And what you have is this super long tail, which is a lot of the folks who don't know a lot, don't have context, and say, yes, persecution is bad, we want to side with oppressors and bring them to freedom and bring down the oppressors. And whether or not, if it's about white, male, colonialism, right? And if that's the language, we're down with that, even if we don't really understand the history or the context. It's like, what do you mean, the Jewish people? Well, 75 years ago, the number one term used with Jew was refugee. There were more Jewish refugees than that was the issue with Jews, was there were refugees coming out of World War II. Today there are 0 Jewish refugees. Why? Because of the state of Israel. Right? We don't have that issue, but we call ourselves a diaspora community, which means we're refugees, right? Because we were kicked out of our homes. But this understanding of who we are, right, has been lost in the current conversation.
So, thinking about all of this, and I want to help us sort of bring this to a hope, to some with a hopeful note. You know how every Haftorah has to end on something positive, right? And that's not to minimize this or say that this is not an ongoing and very deeply intertwined issue, but just we talked about this a little bit before, discussed this before tonight, and both of you were talking about a number of hopeful signs, some things that are strategies that seem to be working, some work that you're doing, Lisa, with young people, Peter, some of the effective strategies that the ADL is able to use. I was wondering if you can maybe talk to us a little bit about that as we close out the evening.
Sure. So I think, and I actually wanted to just say a couple of words about where the arenas in which we see this, because we have a diverse group of people here tonight, and I don't want you to leave here and think that this is only happening on the college campuses, because it could happen in an arena in which you work. And I think that's why it's very important to have these conversations and raise awareness. We're seeing efforts by those pushing the delegitimization agenda pop up in all kinds of places. Just this week, for example, we had a BDS, we almost had a BDS resolution come to city council in a town in Vermont. Fortunately, the person who wrote the resolution ended up walking it back after having been really just, barraged by the Jewish community and told, what this is really about. But we've seen it in city councils before. We've seen it in North Carolina. We've seen it in Boston. It does come up. We're starting to see it in teachers' unions. And just this week, it was this.
Yeah, for sure. In the California Faculty Association, which is my labor union, who knew that, people with PhDs had labor unions. that a list of things that they want to be socially active against, including racism, anti-Asian sentiment, and settler colonialism, which is, we know, if you know anything about this, we know exactly what that's aimed at,
Right.
even though they don't say Israel specifically.
Exactly. I mean, we're seeing it in ports, you know, where ships, Israeli ships there are efforts to block the arrival of Israeli ships. It happened in Long Beach, it happens up in Oakland. We see it, we see efforts to get major companies to withdraw pension funds from either Israeli companies or companies that do business in Israel. So what really, I mean, and in other places as well. So my message really here is for everybody who's concerned about this, to be alert, to keep educating yourself, keep yourselves apprised of what's happening, and keep, you know, engaging in these conversations, because, you know, I think in the field we liken it to playing a game of whack-a-mole, right? I mean, it pops up here, you deal with it here, and then it pops up here. Mainline churches is another place. I mean, it's so pervasive, because they look for places where there's vacuums of power, where there's weakness, or where people are not familiar with these ideas, and then they really try to build networks and roots there. But in terms of what you know, some positive things, look, you know, we are very, we hear about the stories, the big blow-ups, where there are, you know, organizations or groups that really cross the line into anti-Semitism, anti-Zionist forms of anti-Semitism. The women's movement, right, was one of them, where they, you know, and fortunately there was some pretty serious intervention on the part of the Jewish community, and we saw major changes in the women's movement. There are groups, when I say Black Lives Matter, understand that this is not a hierarchical organization, but there are different subgroups within Black Lives Matter where lines have been crossed, and Jewish community organizations have come in and engaged in dialogue. For all of the stories where we hear blow-ups, there are many blow-ups that never happen. And that's because Jewish community organizations like ADL, like federations, like JCRCs, very often stay at the table. And I think that's really critical to remember, that when you're at the table and you can engage in conversation with people and organizations that you've invested time in and that you have built relationships with, you can often do that really critical education work and prevent some of these big crises from happening. So I think that's a very positive thing. Again, it's the story that doesn't happen, right? But that's really important to understand.
Just to extend that, you know, about 8 years ago is when Lisa and I first started doing some work together, when there was a couple anti-Israel propositions that were coming up in the Presbyterian Church and in the Episcopal Church. So we actually said, who do we know? And let's talk to people. We're going to be delegates at these. And at one point we were sitting with, I believe, an Episcopal priest who said, you always come calling when there's like a problem. It's like, you know, and you know, both of us, it wasn't part of our portfolios at the time. It was just something that we cared about. But since that time, we've shown up, right? We're showing up not just when it's a Jewish cause. We show up when it's a cause when anyone is persecuted, when anyone is left out, when anyone is told they don't belong, right? Fighting anti-Semitism is fighting all bigotries and all hatreds against all people, not just for ourselves, and not just doing it because if we show up for them, they'll show up for us, right? We can see through that. It's really being authentically where we are, and I think that's also true from a Jewish values perspective on where we are. So I think, you know, being in coalitions, showing up, being present, you know, for each other, and then you meet each other, you hear each other's stories, and that's much better than trying to teach history on Instagram, is hearing each other's stories. Part of hearing those stories is also, you know, like previous generations, I think there was a lot more concern about criticizing Israel, because that's going to open the door to the anti-Semites, right? That I can hear like my grandparents' generation talking that way, or maybe even my parents' generation. But I think there's an openness now that we can acknowledge that we have concerns about Israel and justice concerns about the Jewish people, but we can also acknowledge that we have real concerns about justice and justice for the Palestinian people. and that without diminishing our commitment and love of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, right? Acknowledging that. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords. We are seeing Arab nations normalize relations with Israel. Much better than peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, where there was a peace treaty, so it was ended hostilities, but you can't say that it was warm relations. I mean, you can get kosher food in the United Arab Emirates, and there are plane flights that go directly there. You don't have to worry about what's in your passport. There is exchanges. So there's a new sense of normalization that's happening, right? This is something to look at, not just for Israel, but also between sort of the Jewish community here, having these normalized relations with a lot of people. You don't have to justify one Israeli policy to say that the Jewish people always have and always will have a right to self-determination and safety and security in our historic homeland. You don't have to defend a government that's right or left or any policy to say that. That is sort of the high ground from a social justice perspective, right? That's taking the language about self-determinations of a people that have lived as refugees for 2,000 years, who are trying to return to their homeland, right, without defending any policy, right? So there's a commonality, there's a common language that really brings us together, and that's starting to be part of our conversations.
That is inspiring. Really, truly. What better way to wrap this all up than to take home the message that the way we fix this is by genuine engagement, by continuing to make the commitment to be an advocate, not because we expect that advocacy back, but because it is simply what we are as Jews called to do. And what a better message for Yom Kippur. So thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Wait, we still have to do Aleinu and Mourner's Kaddish, so here we go. I know, we're almost done. We're almost done. Thank you, everybody. This was so important, and I hope food for thought for everybody with us. I invite you to turn to page 478 in your Machzorim. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol, latet gedula liotzer bereshit, shelo asanu kigoye haratzot, velo samanu kimishbechot hadama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, V'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu shenotei shamayim v'yosed haaretz. Elkeinu nekavel lecha Adonai Eloheinu l'rot mehirav v'tiferu zecha. כי המלכות שלך היא עומדת ימלוך בכבוד, ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא, יהיה אדוני אחד. ושמו echad. You may be seated, except those of you who are observing a yard site or in a period of mourning. The Mourner's Kaddish is found on page 482. Please join me as we honor the memories of our loved ones. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
V'alma divrach l'rutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach la'alam u'almei almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal Shemei Dekudasha Baruchu Le'ela Le'ela Mikol Birchata V'Shirata Tushbechata V'Nechamata Da'amiran Bi'alma V'Imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'Chaim Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imru Amen.
Amen.
Oseh Shalom B'Mromav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imru Amen.
Amen.
Just a few announcements. Our services begin tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and we are literally here all day. And there will be something going on from 9 o'clock all the way till we blow the shofar at 7:30, and then we're serving breakfast. So if you have nowhere to go, you can come be with us, and it'll be very nice. And lots of great davening, incredible music. Let's just give a big hand to our beautiful musicians, Jason, Ron, Jackie. Thank you, guys are so amazing. I want to thank Eric for being my right-hand person in every way. Thank you for helping the service flow so beautifully. Jackie, also, thank you, you and Patty, for everything you did to set up. Lauren, all of our people who just sort of made this happen. I want to thank our wonderful sound people, Justin and Tyler, our video guy. So I hope anybody who's still watching this, if you are, that you can appreciate, you can write a nice little note in the chat and thank Tyler for his great videography. We're going to conclude with Yigdal, the traditional Yigdal, and then for those of you who are going, I can't go home and eat because it's Yom Kippur, Jackie and Ron are going to play a beautiful piece, which I'm going to introduce for you. We opened with classical music. We're going to close with classical music. But first, join me on page 486 for Yigdal. Yigdal Elohim Chai ve'yishtabach Nimsa v'yenet el metziuto Echad v'yen yachid Ke'ichudo Me'elav v'gam ein sof Li'achduto Ein lo demut haguf V'eino guf Lo narot elav Kedushato Kadmo lechol davar Asher ira Rishon V'yein Reshit L'Reshito Hino Adon Olam V'chol Notzar Yoreh Gedulato U'malchuto Shefa Nevuato Netan Oel Anshe Segulato V'tifarto Lo Kam B'Yisrael Kemo She'od Navi Lo Mabit Et Emunato Torah and Ben Natan Liam Oel Al Yad Nevio Neman Beito Lo Yachalifa El Velo Yamir Dato Leolamim Lezulato Sofe V'Yodea Zitarenu Mabit L'Sof Davar B'Kadmato Gomel Leish Chesed Kemifalo Noten L'Resha Ra Kirishato Yishlach L'Ketz Yamin Meshichenu Livdot Mechake Ketz Yeshuato Meitim Yechayel Berov Chasto Baruch Adeyat Shem Tehilato Meitim Yechayel Berov Chasto Baruch Adeyat Shem Tehilato. Also, I just want to again thank you, Peter and Lisa, for giving up your Yom Kippur to join us and to share your great expertise with us, and also to you, Robin and Scott, for shepherding such a meaningful conversation. Yizkor tomorrow will be at about 11:15. Rabbi Stacia Deutsch, who doesn't often take out her rabbi cloak, she's more of an author, will be talking. She's been doing a lot of work in Jewish genealogy, and she's going to be our darshanit, our sermonizer tomorrow. So I hope you'll join us. She'll be here at about 11 o'clock. Okay, so now we are going to close with Scott Spitzer. Yes, I just want to say to everybody, if you know anybody with young people, at 10 o'clock tomorrow, Scott is leading a family service, and they're really fun, and it'll be on Zoom for those of you who live far away, and in person for those of you who can come, and we hope you'll join us. And thank you, Scott, for doing that, because you are really a rock star of family services, and we appreciate it. Okay, listen to this, you guys. Ernest Bloch's From Jewish Life is a set of 3 short pieces or movements written by the composer in 1924 for the cellist Hans Kindler. The first of these is prayer. That's what you're going to hear tonight. Andante moderato, and indeed it has the flavor of a fervently sung prayer or a hymn or petition in a traditional Ashkenazi synagogue. The initial 4-note motif in the minor mode, together with its elaboration in the ensuing phrases, sounds as if it might have served as the skeletal model for Max Janowski's well-known setting of the High Holiday Prayer Avinu Malkeinu in an abridged text adapted by the American Reform Liturgy for the High Holidays. So all you're going to hear is prayer, but when I was listening to this, you can also hear other High Holiday motifs throughout this. He takes stuff from Aleinu. So any of you who sort of have like the sounds of synagogue in your ears will really, really appreciate it. And even if you don't, you're really going to like this because they're awesome. So without further ado, thank you.
Bum